anybody got questions on System 1, System 2, System 3?
What is System 1 called again?
ATP-PC system.
Oh, what is System 1?
Glycolysis,
Second one is
right?
glycolysis. Yeah.
System 1.
Thin on the ground today.
What?
So we're going to be thin on the ground today.
5 feet,
Everyone's away.
very long.
True.
Should get an extra credit. Who said that?
Well, the truth is you kind of do because you'll have a better understanding of it than they all will. So.
We were practice.
But did Mason say she was running?
I don't know.
I think she said she wouldn't be here. I feel like I heard.
Remember the paper?
Yeah.
Have this.
All right, so no questions on how those systems are working because we're going to build on that idea now on how they work and start looking at
What was System 3 called?
System 3. The big word for it is oxidative phosphorylation. Part 1 of System 3 is Krebs cycle. Part 2 is electron transport chain.
That's right.
Got that. Do we need to memorize that huge word?
Oxidative phosphorylation?
Yeah.
If it was there, you would want to be able to recognize it, but you won't need to be able to pull it out of your brain,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. So now we're going to start to use those systems and think about which system am I using at what time, right? And how do they interact? So which substrate I'm using, so that's the molecule that I'm feeding into the system, is going to depend upon availability. So in System 1, we don't use a food, right? We use ATP or phosphocreatine that's already in the cell. So we're not using carbohydrate or fat when we're using System 1. Right? How much energy is produced by the substrate will dictate which one is being used often. Right? And then the really key idea is how hard am I working and how long am I working? Right? So if I eat a meal that is high in carbs, then those carbs will be preferentially used for energy in an acute period of time. If I use a high fat diet, then my body will use a little bit more fat and it will learn to metabolize more fat, but you never use just fat. And there are a lot of health risks involved with eating a high-fat diet. So, and the same idea with proteins. If we eat a high-protein diet, then eventually your body will adjust to using a little bit more protein for energy than it does typically. But again, there are health risks involved with high-protein diets. All right? Remember that mostly we don't use protein for energy. So what we're going to talk about today is the interaction between fats and carbs. Okay. If I'm working anaerobically, I'm either going to be using ATP and PC or I'm going to be using carbohydrate. I cannot use fats in glycolysis. Right? Glycolysis is how we break down a carbohydrate molecule. Anybody remember the name of the system that we use to break down a fat molecule? Triglyceride is the storage form of fat. What's the system, does anybody remember?
Was
We
it,
mentioned it very quickly the other day.
was it that triglycerol or whatever it's called?
Ooh, close. It's beta oxidation,
Beet?
right? And the reason that we don't talk about beta oxidation in this class is because it isn't considered an energy system. When I take triglyceride and I break it down to acetyl-CoA, I don't make any ATP until it's acetyl-CoA and it enters into Krebs cycle. So we don't consider beta oxidation an energy system in the way that we consider glycolysis, that's breaking down carbohydrate, an energy system because we actually get ATP from it. Right? And yesterday, I think it was yesterday, I found a perfect example of one of the media type schisms on these diets that drive me crazy. I was reading junkie magazines and I was looking at people online and there was an article on Jennifer Lopez and how her abs are so great. So I thought, okay, let's see what she's saying, okay? I want to see what she says. So she said, oh yeah, I'm doing a 10-day diet with my boyfriend and we're not eating any sugar or any carbs for 10 days. And I feel great on day 9 and I just can't wait for day 10. Right. So then they talk to her boyfriend is
Alex Rodriguez. That's
Alex
what it was.
Rodriguez, ex-baseball player. Oh yeah, this is great. I feel great. I can't believe how great. No sugar, no carbs. I'm just eating salad. What food group does salad sit under? Is it a protein? If you eat a cucumber or a green pepper, is it protein? So what is it? There's only 3. If it isn't fat and it isn't protein, carbs. So there's this great big, I'm not eating any carbs, I'm just eating salad. So you're eating carbs. That's all you're eating, is carbs. And they're probably putting chicken or egg or fish. So they're eating protein and carbs. Right? So this is the problem. I mean, these people who people look up to spew this nonsense. He ought to know better. He was an athlete, a good athlete, right? And they spew this nonsense, and then people go, oh, I just shouldn't eat any carbohydrate. It's just ignorant. Anyway, so thought I would share that little story. All right, so we're going to look at the interaction between fats and carbs with relation to intensity of exercise to begin with. All right? So, at rest, I'm not working very hard. Okay? Somewhere around 2/3 of the ATP that you need to maintain your body functions and your posture while you're sitting here comes from fat because the workload is so low, right? So you're basically working aerobically, you're sitting here, there's plenty of time to get oxygen to the muscle cells, okay? but you're working so low, you're not really expending very many calories. All right, so there's three things there that you need to get your head around. One, aerobic metabolism isn't high intensity, right? Aerobic metabolism means I'm using oxygen to make ATP. Okay? Intensity means, am I working hard? Am I working moderately? Am I working at a low level? And I can do that aerobically, or I can do that anaerobically, right? Those are two completely separate principles, okay? I said there were three, didn't I? What was the third one? Hello? It's gone, it'll come back. It went. Came in, it went away. Okay, so as we go from working not very hard and we start to increase the intensity, then initially I'm going to use some system 1, and then I'm going to have to switch to using carbohydrates. So the harder I work, the more carbohydrates I start to use. If I'm working at very high intensity, remember if I'm working at high intensity, the length of time I can work is very short. Right? Then at that point, almost all my ATP is coming from carbohydrate. Okay. So there's some variables that play a role in why that happens. Carbohydrate, breaking down carbohydrate, gives me more ATP for a set amount of oxygen that I take into the system. Right? So if I've increased my workload, I need ATP more quickly, and so carbohydrate is more useful. The fast twitch muscle fibers we'll come back to because we do a whole chapter on skeletal muscle. Right? Fast twitch muscle fibers are the ones that are responsible for power, and they work very hard for a very short period of time. So they're really good at using ATP or glycolysis. They're not very good at using aerobic metabolism because their work is generally done before aerobic metabolism kicks in. Right? When we exercise, we see many chemical changes occur in the body. All right? So we release norepinephrine, we release epinephrine, we release cortisol, lots of different hormones that are released in response to exercising. And epinephrine in particular stimulates the enzymes in the glycolytic pathway, and so glycolysis works better. Right? And that lactate that we had, remember that we said if we were working anaerobically, that the pyruvate picks up hydrogen and turns into lactate and is dumped into the bloodstream. Well, lactate somehow manages to inhibit triglyceride breakdown. And I don't know that mechanism, so don't ask me. We could find it out, right? Okay? So although carbohydrate doesn't provide as much energy per molecule as fat does, it's much easier to use when I'm working hard for a short period of time. Right? Smaller molecule breaks down more quickly. I can access the energy with less resort to oxygen and okay. So we get a graph that looks like this. Right, so this is called the crossover. And this particular one is looking at intensity. So along the x-axis we have a level of intensity. On this particular figure they use a percentage VO2 max. It could be percentage heart rate max, it could be RPE, all those intensity measures that we discussed yesterday. Right? And then on the y-axis we have the percentage energy from carbs and triglycerides. Always makes me laugh that they say carbs and triglycerides and not glycogen and triglycerides, but I guess because you can use glucose as well. But it's like they use a storage form for fats, but not the storage form. It seems odd to me. So this blue, that's blue, is carbohydrate. All right? So based on how hard I'm working, so we said when we're not working very hard, we are using predominantly fats, right? Because there's plenty of time to get oxygen to the muscle cell. I've got plenty of time to break down a fat molecule and get at the ATP, right? And we're not using very much carb. As I start to work harder, I start to use more carbohydrate because I need energy quicker. And I can get at carbs more quickly. And so as I use more carbs, I use less fats. Okay. This crossover, if you're using a VO2 max percentage, is about 35%. So it would be probably 45 to 50% of heart rate max. Okay. Now there's another useful tool that we can use alongside this idea. All right? And that's called the fat max zone. And the fat max zone is a graph that looks a bit like that. Here we have intensity. Here we have fat metabolism. And so what this graph is trying to show us is that there's an optimal range of workload for fat use. Okay? Here's intensity, this is workload, fat metabolism, how much fat I'm using to do that work. So here is optimal fat use. So this range, if my intensity measure is percentage heart rate max, then the bottom end of this range is about 68%. And the top end of this range is about 79%. So that means that if losing fat mass is my goal, doing aerobic work within that intensity range is going to help me use the most amount of fat. sense? Okay. Now, as we said yesterday, right, you're going to deal with clients or students who are not fit enough to work at 68% of their heart rate max. Okay? It's not that we don't use fat at lower intensities, because you're using fat now. It's just that this is optimal. Okay? So, if you have a client whose goal is fat loss, but who is very overweight and they can't work this hard, you have to be able to explain to them that the first step is getting fit enough. You'll lose some weight, but you might not lose what you want, because you have to get fit enough to be able to work hard enough to really smack it in the face. Does that make sense? All right, so this is 55 to 72% VO2 max. So it's around here on that graph. But I think that's a little bit confusing because that looks like we're using less fat. We're using a lot of fat though, we're just using carbohydrate more. Okay, so that's when we're looking at intensity. But I said the other variable that was really important is duration. Okay, so what happens when we're looking at what's the interaction like when we're looking at duration? Okay. So how long do I need to work? And Rice asked a good question way back at the beginning of the semester about at what point do I use fat, right? So this is the answer to his question here. So if I'm working at the same intensity, so if I'm on the treadmill or I'm on the bike and I'm working at steady state, okay, then we get a gradual shift from carbohydrate towards fat over time, because now I've got long enough to start breaking these fat molecules down, and they give me way more energy than a carbohydrate molecule does. So if I'm going for long enough, it's very useful to access fat as an energy source, right? So there's some clever food nutrition info that you want to pay attention to, again, if your goal is fat loss, all right? Because if you eat carbohydrate as your snack before training, okay, that carbohydrate will trigger an insulin response to move the carbohydrate out of the bloodstream into the muscle. The problem is that insulin response squashes lipase, which is the enzyme that facilitates breaking down fat. And so if I've got a high carb meal and then I'm going to go exercise, that high carb meal will inhibit me using fats when I'm exercising. So that's something to pay attention to, again, depending on who you're working with and what their goal is. Right? If I'm working for a long time, more than an hour, then at some point I can use up almost all my glycogen. So remember we said that glycogen stores are finite, it's like a pantry, right? I've got a couple of shelves that are my liver, and the rest of the pantry are my muscles, and I can fill the pantry up, but once I start using it, I can empty it out. I can't do that with my fat pantry. It never empties out, right? So when I am doing a long distance event, like a marathon or a triathlon or something like that, then that point at which I run out of glycogen, or the stores are getting really low, athletes often call hitting the wall. It's the point at which they have to slow down or stop, right? So if they time the race wrong or they time their carbohydrates wrong, then they get to within a mile of the finish line and their legs suddenly go and they have to slow way down and possibly even walk, right? A really good athlete, a world-class athlete, will carb load before the race, so their pantry is full to the brim. They will take carb drinks every 20 minutes or so during the race, or they'll take one of those little jelly cubes, right? And they won't allow their carbohydrate stores to run out, so that as they get to a mile or 2 miles from the line, they can then sprint, because they can ramp up the intensity and use carbohydrate through glycolysis. Okay. So it gets very clever. Like, how do I manipulate this? How do I time everything to get it right? Okay.
So carbs are good for like long distance and like time and wise. And then so if you want to lose weight, you wouldn't eat carbs right before workout, right? Because that's what.
It's going to depend a little bit on, so theoretically, yes, you wouldn't want to eat carbs before the workout because you want to push the fats to kick in. Having said that, if you are dealing with someone who suffers with low blood sugar, with hypoglycemia, if they don't have some carb and you push them really hard in the workout, they're going to get lightheaded and possibly pass out. So it really starts to become an individual thing. You've got to know your person or yourself well. It's the point at which I'll start saying you need to start keeping logs. You should keep a heart rate log, because if you take your resting heart rate every morning before you sit up in bed and you get sick, you'll know you're sick 2 days before you feel sick, because your heart rate will go up in response to the virus before you start showing symptoms from the virus, right? So if you keep your heart rate log on a regular basis and you know your pattern, and all of a sudden you're waking up and you're 5, 6, 7, 8 beats higher than normal, then you can start taking some measures, right? Sleep a few extra hours, make sure you're warm, get your fluids, and see if you can knock the cold on the head a little bit quicker than you would have been able to. I mean, you can't stop it, it's going to kick in anyway, but you can deal with it more effectively if you know it's coming, right? If you keep a food log and you tie your food log to your training log, then you can start to see, how did I feel on that day? What did I eat the day before? Why did it work or not work? Why did I feel like I could bounce around forever? Or why did I feel like my legs weigh 100 pounds each? Right? What did I eat? You can start to make the connection there. It's very clever stuff. It's cool. Okay, so I want to actually go back to the other graph, because now we have a different crossover, right? So now, instead of this being intensity, this is going to be time, because I'm looking at duration. All right? So I'm still looking at, is my energy coming from carbs or fats, but now I'm looking at time rather than workload. And so now the blue line is fat, and the orange line is carbs. So now what we have is a crossover in time, at which point my body is better able to utilize fats as an energy source. And that crossover is somewhere around 20 minutes. Depending upon the person, of course. So now I've got several different factors to play with, right? I've got the fact that I need enough carbs to work hard, but I want to work within this intensity range if I want to maximize the use of my fat, even though I'm using carbs. Right? But I can't get to this fat metabolism unless I'm working for a minimum of 20 minutes, which means really I need to work for 30 minutes or more, because I only start using fats at 20 minutes. So when people go down to the gym and they go, oh, I'll just run for 15 minutes really hard and I'll lose fat, you're not touching fat stores in a 15-minute hard run. There's all kinds of things wrong with that idea, right? 15 minutes is too short, high intensity uses carbs, not fats. Not gonna work, right?
So you would have to do like a longer time with like less intensity?
Yes. And here's the thing, and I'm not that fit, so for you guys it will be quite difficult. When I wear my heart rate monitor, I was saying the other day, in the summer when it's hot, and I want to power walk, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm never, right? Or I'm on my bike and Brian's like zooming off down the road and I'm watching my heart rate monitor and I'm having to slow down to get my heart rate back down into my fat net zone. Because I want to get rid of all that, right? And he's like, come on. I'm like, I can't. This is how hard I'm allowed to work, right? So it actually will feel, if you're really in shape, this feels like you're doing nothing.
That's crazy.
If you're not in shape and you're unfit or you're overweight, this feels really hard. Okay. So if I don't consume carbohydrates, so if I go for a run or a bike ride, and my goal is fat loss, then you probably don't want to go for longer than 55, 60 minutes. Because up to about 60 minutes, you've got enough carb stores to manage. And so then you don't have to take some carbohydrate while you're working out, and then you don't impact your fat metabolism. If you're going to work out for 2 hours, now you've got a problem because you really need to carb dip during the second hour, and when you carb dip, it cuts your fat metabolism down. So if your goal is fat metabolism, you want to keep those workout sessions to an hour, between half an hour and an hour, so that you can get away without having to carb dip, right? You don't get the lightheaded, you don't get the wobbly legs. I don't need to have a handful of sultanas, I can keep going, right? Or half a banana or whatever. Okay. So it's all just separate tools. The more tools you have, the better program you can create for an individual, depending upon their goal. stuff, huh?
That's right.
It makes everything so much simpler. Like,
Well, it changes the approach, I think. If you're willing to be open-minded and take it on board, it will change how you approach your training and people that you're training. You know, even if you're a PE teacher and it's going to be students, you've still got to teach them how to be healthy and what they need to do in the gym to be healthy, right? So you can pull this stuff in as well. Right. So the next principle, I think I want to, we're going to change tack quite a bit and talk about lactate threshold. And this is to do with fitness rather than to do with fat metabolism. So I think I will leave lactate threshold until Monday. And then we'll look at lactate threshold, adaptations, EPOC. We've got to look at EPOC. So Monday will be quite chocker. So come in, get plenty of sleep for the weekend, make sure you eat lunch, make sure you're hydrated so you can concentrate on Monday. Okay?